Hey there guys, alright, today we are back with some Armchair Historian, this time one of his older videos, How Did Japan Invade China in World War II? Animated History. Before we dive into the video, make sure you check out the links below in my description box or in my pinned comment in the comment section below. Got a link to my gaming channel here on YouTube and a link to my Twitch channel. Love it if you threw me a follow, hung out in the chat. Now, let me shift this mic a bit. Nothing really to say here, let's learn.
By our supporters on Patreon. If you want to join the community and help us reach our next goal, consider making a pledge.
Man, it's crazy how long ago this video was now.
Despite the massive death toll and sheer magnitude of the confrontation, the second...
Wow, this is a really old video. The OG setup here. Wow.
Sino-Japanese War is often overlooked as a part of the Second World War. This conflict played a major role in deciding the victor of the ongoing Chinese Civil War, a war that would transform China into the communist state that exists today. I'm Griffin Johnson, the Armchair Historian.
Had it not been for the Japanese invasion, China quite possibly would not have become communist.
And today we'll be exploring the causes and course of the Second Sino-Japanese War. But first, I'd like to say thanks to our sponsors over at Banknote World. I always say that everyone should have at least one hobby, whether that be indoors or outside. YouTube channel in the description below. Now back to the topic at hand. To understand the precarious situation that led up to the Second Sino-Japanese War, it is important to mention the events of 19th century China. The century can be characterized as one of factionalism, lawlessness, foreign intervention by Western powers, and rising nationalist sentiments, which in 1911 culminated in the overthrow of the established Qing dynasty by the Nationalist Republicans, or Kuomintang. This led to intense regionalism across China as warlords took control of small territories that they ruled in their own name. By the 1920s, the spread of communism led to the creation of the Chinese Communist Party, or CCP, which was suppressed by the Kuomintang, the leader of which was the cunning Chiang Kai-shek, who subjugated influential warlords in order to secure his rule over China. Soon after, Chiang turned his attention towards the communists, igniting the Chinese Civil War in 1927.
Hirohito.
Japan, by contrast, had been relatively isolated for millennia. The island nation had developed a highly militaristic society, and this was intensified after the Emperor of Japan consolidated his power in what was known as the Meiji Restoration, with its population's adherence to warrior and feudal codes translating into...
I'm really liking this very quick summary he's giving of the historical events, like of the Chinese Civil War, and Meiji's restoration. I think these are very well written summaries. You know, obviously complex historical events, but for the purpose of the video, they're getting what he get across words.
Into a religious devotion to the emperor. These years of seclusion contributed to the development of a xenophobic mentality. The Japanese viewed their culture as the most sophisticated and civilized. This sense of national pride continued to inflate despite increased influence of the West in matters of technology and trade throughout the 19th and 20th centuries. The combination of ultranationalism, a centralized state, and European technology allowed Japan, in the First Sino-Japanese War, to conquer Korea from the Chinese, whose administrative process and technology paled in comparison. The Japanese would continue to expand throughout the Pacific and onto the East Asian mainland. The requirements of both a large population and a large military began to strain the Japanese economy, causing ever deeper expansion into the Asian mainland. In September of 1931, Japan invaded Manchuria, which offered ample resources and living space. As justification, Japan cited the Mukden incident, in which elements of the
whatever that is in Japanese
Imperial Japanese Army detonated a small amount of dynamite at a section of the South Manchuria Railway, which had been granted to them in the Russo-Japanese War. The Japanese then falsely accused China of sabotage. Despite receiving orders to keep the incident contained at a local level, the Japanese army proceeded to capture all of the cities along the South Manchuria Railway, and surprisingly, the Republic of China maintained a policy of non-resistance, although some Chinese warlords and generals tried to resist, but unsuccessfully. By February of 1932, Japan had control over all of Manchuria, establishing the puppet state of Manchukuo, which, interestingly, was governed by the last emperor of China, the 26-year-old Po Yi. The Chinese appealed to the League of Nations in response, and after a year-long investigation, the League concluded that the invasion was unjustified, to which Japan simply left the League of Nations.
Yeah.
Chiang Kai-shek was aware that the Japanese interests in China were not over, and so in 1936 he agreed to an alliance with the Communists, putting the Chinese Civil War on hold. Less than 1 year later, the Second Sino-Japanese War would break out in full when, on the 7th of July, Japanese troops conducted a military exercise near the Marco Polo Bridge in Wanping, which startled the Chinese garrison who weren't warned in advance. In the resulting confusion, shots were exchanged, and after the skirmish ended, the Japanese noticed one of their men was missing after a head count. When the Chinese refused to allow them to search the city, the Japanese attacked the city head-on, trying to cross the bridge. On July 20th, Japan began bombarding Wanping, and by the end of the month had taken Beijing and the surrounding areas. The Japanese were initially content with the territory they'd taken in northern China and wanted to end the war quickly, but Chiang Kai-shek was not giving up anytime soon. He decided to open up a second front at the city of Shanghai, storming the Japanese quarter of the city on the 13th of August. The fighting around the Shanghai area lasted for a total of 3 months, marked by intense close quarters combat. Shanghai finally fell when an amphibious Japanese force landed in the southern region of the city, which was left undefended. The Chinese took heavy casualties, losing 250,000 men, many of them their highest quality troops, while the Japanese lost 60,000. On the 8th of November, Chiang ordered his forces to retreat west, towards the city of Nanking, the capital of China at the time. The Chinese in Nanking were positioned in elaborate fortifications inside and outside of the city. Despite these defenses, the Japanese had captured the southern portion of the city by December 12th, which prompted Chiang to evacuate his troops from the city. The Japanese were frustrated after what they thought would be an easy victory. This frustration translated into brutality against the civilians, who were raped and executed on an immense scale. Estimates for the number of casualties ranges from 50,000 to 300,000. The massacre is possibly the defining event in the Second Sino.
I think I lean towards 200,000. I think that seems to be I think that's around the most consistent number I've seen casualties of Nanking.
Japanese War, and is possibly one of the single largest atrocities in human history. As such, the event remains one of the primary reasons why, even today, relations between Japan and China are at best somewhat bitter. By 1939,
that's one way to put it. I think they still strongly hate each other.
The war was beginning to reach a stalemate.
At best.
The Chinese still refused to surrender despite huge casualties and territorial losses, and had begun to receive much-needed experience and foreign aid. Meanwhile, the Japanese lines of communication were being stretched to their limit, and Japanese forces had suffered substantial losses in both equipment and manpower. However, Japanese spirits were lifted when their German ally signed a non-aggression pact with the Soviet Union, whom the Japanese feared would invade Manchuria and their holdings in northern China. On September 14, 13 days after Germany invaded Poland, a Japanese force of 100,000 men attacked the city of Changsha, which was the next major target on the road to Chongqing, where the Chinese government had been relocated. A force of 240,000 Chinese soldiers repelled them, inflicting more casualties than they had sustained. On October 6, the Japanese withdrew and allowed the Chinese to regain lost ground in the surrounding areas. Changsha was the first major Chinese city that managed to fight off the Japanese successfully. While the Kuomintang tended to partake in large, sweeping operations, their communist allies in the north had mainly opposed the Japanese through insurgency and guerrilla tactics. But under pressure from Chiang Kai-shek, the Communist Party of China began to execute large offensive actions. On the 20th of August, 1940, the CCP gathered 400,000 men of the 8th Route Army and assaulted numerous staging areas and railways, which were defended by 420 Japanese and collaborationist Chinese forces in what would be called the 100 Regiments Offensive. Although the Japanese and collaborators pushed them back, the communists considered their campaign successful because it resulted in the destruction of about 600 miles of railroad tracks. The remainder of the Second Sino-Japanese War was marked by repeated failed attempts by the Japanese to take various strategic cities. It wasn't until near the end of the Second World War when, on the 9th of August 1945, 3 days after the atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima, the Soviet Union declared war on Japan and promptly destroyed the primary Japanese army in Manchuria. On the 15th of August, Japan surrendered, ending the Second Sino-Japanese War and ending the occupation of China. Within a year, the Chinese Civil War began again. But that is a story for another day.
Alright, that was quick. But, you know, for how old this video is for Armchair Historian, I think he still did a great job here. Because this is definitely one of his older ones. But, yeah, definitely really short. I don't know what else to really say. I mean, covered a decent amount of information, but didn't necessarily, I feel like, answer the how. Kind of more talked broadly on the invasion of China. It didn't really seem to focus much on the how Japan really got there, more of the broad fighting that was occurring, right? That makes sense. But still a well-made video. I hope you guys enjoyed. Remember to hit that like button and subscribe for more, and I will see you guys in the next video. Peace.